But like, what is the Fed going to do here? I mean, are they just going to keep pushing this out and out and out into the future?
Nothing. The Fed is going to do nothing. And I think I think if you've been through a few Fed cycles in your career, I think the sort of two things that the reaction function, let's say, of the Fed is often to do nothing until there is such a significant growth or inflation dynamic that it motivates them to move rapidly. And so, well, it's very typical to see these periods where essentially nothing happens for, it can happen for years on end, because as long as growth conditions don't deteriorate, there really is no motivation. Like, why, if you're in the Fed shoes right now, like, why would you change monetary policy? Like, what would be the reason? Like, unemployment's at secular lows, growth is fine, and on the margin, inflation is a little too high relative to what you'd like to see. Why would you cut when you could just sit and wait? And I think that's what we're seeing. That's sort of the big surprise, I think, to the market really in the last couple of years, is that particularly when it comes to pricing in what's in the short rate market, expectations have been wildly, all over the place in terms of expecting huge cuts and then hikes and then cuts, and today we're about zero, when in reality, like, what's happened over the last 18 months is like not much, right? Really not much. So not much is going on with the economy, and not much is going on with the Fed. And so, we've got this like not much world, but expectations are wildly moving around everywhere, right? And so the trade has been to fade the expectations, not to run with them.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really come up with the only argument I've heard to cut, and I don't think it's really valid anymore because we've seen inflation come up, is the idea that if they think, and you're going to tell me they're probably not, but if they think they actually are very tight where they are right now, and they want to stick the landing, and they see inflation coming down, they would want to ease into it as opposed to what they usually do, which is something goes horribly wrong, they cut a lot. But I think unfortunately that's probably not valid anymore. I mean, inflation's going up, not down. So there's probably not much of a case to be doing any cutting right now. I don't know if you agree with any of that I just said.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, particularly those who are asset holders, really hoped that what was being said by some governors, I call them the real raters, was true, and sort of forgot the fact that, like, it doesn't really matter whether the Fed thinks monetary policy is tight or easy. It really doesn't. The Fed responds to the data that it sees. If growth is okay and inflation is too high, then, at a minimum, it doesn't do anything. Maybe it hikes, but at a minimum, it doesn't do anything. They and the 500 quants with PhDs can sit around and, pontificate about whether monetary policy is tight or easy. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference. What makes a difference is what's going on with growth and what's going on in inflation. And so you got to focus on those things, because that is what's going to determine their policy. To be clear, like, the real rate situation in terms of, the Fed's view of real rates today is basically no different than it was 4 months ago when everyone thought that there were going to be 7 cuts, right? The thing that's been different is measured inflation is a little too hot and growth continues to be pretty good. Right? That's what's going on, and that's what's motivating their behavior. Too many people, way too focused on some random academic theories being promoted by these governors. It would be so much better if they just stopped talking. Then people wouldn't be confused by their totally misleading either expectations of future conditions or their misleading frameworks of how the decision making works.
I'm just curious, when we think out longer term, like structural inflation, we've had these forces that have driven inflation down, technology being one, globalization was one in the past, and demographics. Like, those are kind of the reasons we're always given as to why inflation was low for such a long period of time. Like, when we come out of this period, I mean, do you think those are different now? I mean, do you think we have a higher level of long-term structural inflation than we did in the period before?
We may or may not have higher structural inflation. It comes down to whether the Fed or the central banks in the developed world want to choose to accept a higher level of inflation, or if they're willing, or if what they're going to do is constrain nominal demand relative to what it would have been otherwise, in order to keep inflation down. And the reason why I say that is it's clear that some of the big disinflationary pressures that have been so beneficial over the last 20 years are not repeatable. Trying to enter the WTO, that's not going to happen again. We had a massive boom in cross-border trade where production went to the cheapest to produce areas of the world. That's not going to happen again. We had 30 years of the most peaceful time in U.S. or in global history over the last 1,000 years in the last 30 years. Maybe that happens, but it sure looks like we're moving in the opposite direction. And so you put all those things together, and the disinflationary impulses that existed before are unlikely to persist into the future. I think the interesting question is, what does the central bank do about that? Because part of why we were able to have such high real growth in the 90s and 2000s was because central banks were getting the dividend, the peace and disinflation dividend, and so they let economies run hotter than they otherwise would be. But if that's not there, are they going to choose to constrain economic growth, or are they going to let inflation run hot? I mean, so far they've let inflation run hot.